reframing policy questions requires a bedrock of evidence, most of which the National Bureau of Statistics could do certainly much better, but does at a very high level and on a consistent basis. So we think that's it. But that aside, I think in May of this year, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, which has very modest resources from the public sector, published the Kenya Poverty Report based on data for 2021. And the Kenya Poverty Report reports basically, as it states, an update on what the poverty rates and trends are in Kenya. An essential service in our view, but also quite critical for just people in and outside government to gain literacy around the most important social welfare indicators within Kenya. So that's the purpose for our discussion today. Now, in looking at that discussion, it was reported in the press, of course, on the day of the launch, in pieces here and there highlighting what many people would like to think. But basically, I and some of our colleagues at the Institute of Economic Affairs have looked at this report, gone through it. It's a fairly elaborate report, and we have extracted some insights, because I think the presentation of the data is one thing, and that's the work of the National Bureau of Statistics completed. I think how we, as citizens, use that report just for our own education, for setting up platforms, but also expanding and elevating public knowledge and the debate around critical questions of development in Kenya becomes our role. So two of my colleagues, Noah Malwa, who's program officer in our public finance and management program, and Maureen Barasa, an assistant program officer in our popular economics program. I've taken the opportunity to try and create a public education by disassembling the report, synthesizing some of that data, and extracting limited insights, which we hope to use. And so we have three purposes for this discussion. One, to expand its familiarity of those who attend this webinar with the report itself, to understand what it is, that its content. Two, help with building literacy to be able to read that data, and hope that in building that literacy, we create in the tradition of democratic civics, people who actually use that data to inform whatever decisions they make, but also to understand how specific policies would work out, given what the foundational data suggests. And just thirdly, basically, to try, as my colleagues will show in a while, to extract that data and extract insights, but more importantly, to propose what kind of outcomes could be improved, or rather how poverty could be reduced, or its effects reduced on households and individuals, based on a couple of proposals. So without further ado, I'll invite my colleague, Maureen. So this will be a presentation by two people, as I said, Noah, Malwa, and Maureen. So Maureen will take us through a background of the report and the key highlights, and then Noah will handle the second part of that here. So Maureen, you have 20 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be taking you through the first part of our webinar, which is titled The Key Insights from the Kenya Poverty Report. And just looking at the outline, there are a couple of things that we'll be discussing, and that's why does poverty measurement matter? We'll be explaining a couple of points as to why poverty measurement matters, and a summary of macro and socioeconomic statistics. This includes the GDP per capita, employment and government expenditure, and among other things. Then we'll be looking at the sample size, allocation, clusters, and household map that the KNBS used to come up with these poverty numbers, and also the survey response rates across different households, both in the rural and urban setup, and also the poverty indicators. These are the different poverty lines, and we'll get to see this as we move on in the presentation. Also, the Gini coefficient, which measures the extent to which distribution of consumption expenditure deviates from a perfectly equal distribution, and it will be explained later in the presentation. And the sixth thing that we'll be looking at, the poverty education level of household heads, and we'll be looking at the correlation between the two, and lastly, we'll be looking at child poverty, and we'll give a conclusion as the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I hope that you'll be able to stay with us throughout the presentation till the end. On the first slide, why does poverty measurement matter? And we got like the first 6 from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics from the Kenya Poverty Report 2021. And the first reason as to why poverty measurement matters is it provides information to guide policy and program formulation targeting the poor. From these numbers of, say, the different poverty lines, it's easier to provide policy and recommendations for different areas, both in the rural and urban setup, and also to avail data to guide resource allocation to the devolved system of government. This, apart from the national level, these poverty numbers have been computed across the 47 counties. So it will provide a resource allocation according to the severity of poverty across these 47 counties. Then we'll be looking at providing estimates of private consumption for compilation of GDP, and these poverty numbers have been calculated according to a certain threshold. If you're below a certain threshold, you're considered maybe food poor, overall poor, or hardcore poor, and we'll get to see that later on. Next, it will be providing data for monitoring progress towards achievement of Sustainable Development Goals 1, 2, and 10 on ending poverty and hunger, reduction in inequality. So the Sustainable Development Goals 1, it covers on, it mainly speaks to no poverty, like achieving no poverty, to end poverty in all forms everywhere, be it food poverty or poverty in other areas that are considered important, maybe shelter and clothing. For Sustainable Development Goal 2, it speaks to zero hunger, to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition. And by computing these poverty measurements, numbers across the country and different counties, and also the rural and urban setup, we'll be able to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition by maybe equal resource allocation, or looking at how to anchor maybe recommendations and policies to end hunger and food poverty. And also for Sustainable Development Goal 10, it's anchored towards reducing inequality. Then the fifth reason will be to provide annual microdata use for research by governments, academia, non-state actors, and the public. This is more or less related to using these numbers to provide policy and recommendations that are backed by data, and provide comprehensive information on an annual basis to inform planning and policy making. This is also in regard to resource allocation and also policies that will maybe be towards achieving zero hunger and no poverty. And finally, at the Institute of Economic Affairs, we added one that is raising literacy on poverty data, because there's a little bit of confusion around the numbers. So by increasing, raising the literacy on poverty data, it would be beneficial in coming up with policies and recommendations around the same. In the next slide, we have a table for summary of macro and socioeconomic statistics. It's across a 6-year series from 2015 to 2021, and it's covering several parameters, that is population, GDP per capita, and GDP growth. Then we have employment across the formal and informal sectors. Then we have expenditure across different fiscal years, that is 2015-16 all the way to 2020-21, and it covers expenditure for two main sectors, that is the education sector and health sector expenditure. So going back to the top, we'll be looking at population, and from this you can deduce that the population has been growing all across the years from 2015 to 2021, whereby it has grown by around 5 million, from 44.2 million all the way to 49.4 million in 2021. And for the GDP per capita, the GDP per capita, which is the final value of all goods and services distributed across a population in 1 year. And generally, the GDP per capita has been increasing. We can see that it's 168,295. That was in 2015, and it's currently at 190,303. That was in 2021 when the Kenya Poverty Report was done. And generally, the GDP per capita has been increasing, and this shows that the welfare has been increasing across the population. So looking at the next thing, we have the GDP growth in percentage. That's a percentage. And in 2015, it was at 5%, and 2021, it's at 7.5%. However, in 2020, there was a reduction to 0.3%. It was a COVID year, and we also had locust infestation during the same year. And the GDP growth, it's positive. There's no negative recorded in any year. Even in 2020, when we had COVID and locust infestation, as much as it's positive, we haven't registered a high and consistent economic growth rates relative to Kenya's Vision 2030. And on average, it's less than 5% if you calculate for all years from 2015 to 2021. Next, we'll be looking at the formal the employments, both in the formal and informal sector, and that's in thousands here. And so for the formal sector employment has been growing at a slower rate, and we can see that it's increased from 2.6 million to 2.8 million. That's around 300,000 increase. This is a slower growth rate compared to the informal sector, which has increased from 12.5 million all the way to 15.3 million. And the growth from 12.6 million in 2015 to 15.3 million in 2021 for the informal sector shows that the employment sector numbers for the informal sector have been increasing rapidly compared to that of the informal sector numbers. And moving on, we'll be looking at the government expenditure. And the government expenditure is across different fiscal years. And from the 2015-16 all the way to 2020-21. And the government expenditure in general has been increasing from 2.05 trillion, that's in 2015-16, to 3.4 trillion in 2020-21. Looking at the education expenditure, education expenditure has also been growing from 313.4 billion, that is in 2015-16, to 486.06 billion, that is in 2020-21. And the health expenditure has also been increasing, and it has almost increased by 4 times the amount. That was 34.7 billion in 2015-16 to 110.15 billion in 2021. Both the education and health sectors comprise of huge expenditure tickets, and this can be explained. It's around 18% if we look at the fiscal year 2020-21. If you add the 486.06 billion and 110.15 billion as a share of the total government expenditure, that was 3.4 trillion. It's around 18% of the total expenditure. And this can be explained by the free primary education that the government has been funding, and also leasing of medical equipment over the years. Next slide, we'll be looking at the sample size and allocation. The 2021 Kenya Continued Household Survey. This was the third consecutive annual survey in the program. Before, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics used to conduct this survey over a 10-year period. The last survey, the previous survey was in 2005-06, and the next survey that was conducted as the Kenya Integrated Budget Household Survey was in 2015-16. And they noticed that there was a huge gap in the data collection, and probably it provided a hard time for people who were analyzing this data. And so they decided to do it quarterly, in a quarterly manner, and it's been done since 2019-20 all the way to 2020-21 as the latest one. So this is the third annual survey in the program. And in this survey, it was done across as 50 study domains, that is the national, the urban, the rural, and 47 counties, and that makes it 50 study domains. And the sample size consisted of 1,500 clusters and 24,000 households. And the clusters were randomized into 4 quarters. The 4 quarters are from the 15,000 clusters, 1,500 clusters was 375 clusters. And from the 24,000 households, that was 6,000 households. The next thing that we'll be looking at is the distribution of sample clusters for the 2021 Kenya Continued Household Survey. And it was done across rural clusters and urban clusters. The rural clusters are in blue, the urban clusters are in red, and we have the water bodies in sky blue. So looking at this map, we can see that most of the clusters were, both the rural and urban clusters were around the western region of Kenya and the central region of Kenya. And like the dense clusters were in the western and central region of Kenya and along the coast. And this has passed distribution of clusters around the northeastern region, the eastern region, and generally across the north and the eastern region. And this is used to show that the clusters were spread. The distribution of these clusters was used to show that the clusters were spread in a way to enhance the representation of the sample. The next slide, we'll be looking at the survey response rates. And the survey response rates were done using different response indicators, and the residence areas that the survey response were collected were in urban areas and in rural areas. And for the indicators that were used were households that were selected for interviewing and the households that were found eligible. Then finally, the households that were interviewed and the response rate. The response rate is a percentage of households interviewed as a share of the households that were eligible. So in the urban setup, the households that were selected were 9,024 in the urban setup, then 14,976 in the rural setup, making it a total of 24,000 households for these surveyed. Then the households that were eligible were 7,028 in the urban setup and 12,494 in the rural setup, making it a total of 19,522 households. And out of the 7,028 urban households that were eligible, only 5,605 households were interviewed in the urban setup, and out of the 12,494 households that were eligible in the rural setup, only 11,340 were interviewed. And this share of households in the urban setup, out of the 5,605 out of the 7,028, only made up a response rate of 79.8%. And the 11,340 households in the rural setup, out of the 12,484 households in the rural setup, made up 90.8%. And in total, at least 86.8% were interviewed in this exercise. Looking at this, we can see that there was a low household response rate in the urban setup compared to the rural setup, and this can be explained. This can be explained by probably like a plausible explanation. There was more commitment away from the place of residence in the urban setup compared to the rural setup. Next, we'll be looking at the different poverty indicators. The poverty indicators are divided into different poverty lines. You have the food poverty line and the overall poverty line. And in the food poverty line, we'll be looking at the average required daily per adult equivalent calorie requirement is 2,250 kilocalories. This was established in the 2015-16 Kenya Integrated Household Budget Survey. And the resultant monthly food poverty lines were 2,331 shillings in the rural setup and 2,905 shillings in the urban setup. For overall poverty, it's anchored on both rural and urban food poverty. And it's explained by, in addition to basic food needs, the overall poverty line allows for basic non-food expenditures on, say, shelter, clothing, and personal care, which are essential to social participation of individuals. So it's majorly food plus non-food expenditure. And the overall poverty lines in monthly adult equivalent terms were 3,947 for the rural setup and 7,193 in the urban areas. Next, we'll be looking at the percentage distribution of household food consumption by source and residence. It's across the three domains, three of the 50 domains, that is the national, rural, and urban setup. And it's divided by the food consumption source, that is whether the food was purchased or it was in stock, on production and gifts. And from this, the national had a high percentage of purchased or food in stock at 80.2%, and 14.6% was from on production, and 5.2% was gifts. The rural setup had purchase or stock for household food consumption as 74%, 20% was on production, and 6% was gifts. For the urban areas, it's 93.5% as purchase or stock, 3.1% as on production, and 3.4% as gifts. And moving on, we'll be looking at the different poverty lines. For the poverty line, it's explained as the minimum expenditure required by an individual to fulfill his or her basic food and non-food needs. So when you are doing the poverty indicators, you had like two poverty lines. So in this case, we'll be looking at three poverty lines. The three headcount poverty estimates are presented, they are based on the two poverty lines, that's the food and overall poverty lines. The food poverty is computed as individuals or households whose food consumption per adult equivalent was less than 2,331 per month in rural areas and 2,905 per month in urban areas, respectively. So individuals who are below this threshold were considered to be food poor in both rural areas and urban areas, respectively. And for those who are considered to be overall or absolute poor, these are individuals whose total consumption per adult equivalent was less than 3,947 per month in rural areas and 7,193 per month in urban areas. For the hardcore or extreme poverty, hardcore or extreme poverty is explained as individuals who are below, individuals or households whose total consumption per adult was equivalent was less than 2,331 per month in rural areas and less than 2,905 per month in urban areas, respectively. These are people who are living in abject poverty in such a way that probably if they had a certain amount of money, they couldn't afford 2,331 per month, say in rural areas, to just buy food. Next, we'll be looking at the mean monthly food and non-food expenditure per adult equivalent in 2021. And it will be across certain parameters, the residence, the expenditure, and the percentage share. The residents will be looking at the national, rural, and the urban, and the expenditure is either food or non-food expenditure, and the percentage share of either the food and non-food expenditure. So for the national on food expenditure is 3,356 and 4,037 on non-food, making it a total of 7,383. And for the rural, it's 2,991 on food and 2,234 on non-food, making it 5,225 total expenditure on both food and non-food in the rural setup. And for urban, it's 4,132 on food and 7,870 on non-food, making it a total of 12,001 for the total expenditure on both food and non-food expenditure in the urban setup. And from this, we can see this. If you can remember the threshold that we had for food poverty, we can see that there's a huge disparity in food expenditure in the urban setup, whereby the threshold from the 2015-16 Kenya Integrated Household Budget Survey was 2,905, but the mean monthly food expenditure per adult in 2021 was 4,132. And this is a difference of around 1,227, while in rural areas it was 2,331, while the mean monthly food and non-food food expenditure, in 2021 was 2,991, which explains a disparity of 660. Looking at this, the mean monthly food expenditure amount is higher than the minimum expenditure, the minimum threshold for the urban setup. And the rural areas are close to the food poverty line than in urban areas. This confirms high inequality in urban areas than in rural areas in terms of food expenditure according to the minimum threshold. Next, it's the summary trends in poverty incidence between 2015-16 and 21 as a share of the total population. And it's divided across different indicators, that is the overall poverty rate, the food poverty rate, hardcore poverty rate, distribution of the overall poor and population living in overall poverty, and the population distribution and different places of residence. We have the national, rural, and urban, and the poor individuals for different years, that is 2015-16, and when the first Kenya Continuous Household Survey was carried out in 2019, all the way to the third one in 2021. And the percentage point changes in 1 year, that is between 2021 and 2020. And from this, we'll just make the main pointers from this. We can see that hardcore poverty is more pronounced in the rural setup than in the urban setup. That is, hardcore poverty in the rural setup, for instance, in 2021 was 7.8%, while in the urban setup it's 1.5%. This is such a huge disparity. And also, looking at food poverty, the 30.5% of poor individuals in 2021 represented 38.6% of the overall poor individuals, represented 19.1 million of people in the whole country. 40.7% represented 13.7 million people in the whole country, and 34.1% of the overall poor people, represented 5.4% of the total poor individuals. Finally, we'll be looking at a summary of the 2021 headcount poverty measure, and it's across the three residences. We have the national, rural, and urban residents, and we'll be looking at across the three poverty lines. We have the food poverty, overall poverty, and hardcore poverty, and the poor individuals as a percentage of the population and in nominal numbers, in thousands. Yeah, so looking at this at the national level, the 30.5% represented 15 imply that 15.1 million did not meet the food poverty line threshold, and 38.6% of the poor individuals, represented 19.1 million people, did not meet the overall poverty line. Then 5.8% of the poor individuals population meant that 2.8 million people did not meet the hardcore poverty line. This meant that the people lived in abject poverty and were unable to meet the minimum required food consumption basket, even if...
My name is Noah Malwa. I work in the Public Finance Management Program, and it's my pleasure to take you through the last part of this presentation. Yeah, so Maureen has taken us through a bit of methodology and the background of this report and highlighted the main dichotomy between the urban and rural setting. And the reason for this is because the urban setting has peculiar characteristics which are very different compared to the rural setting. So for example, whereas the amount of calories that are required, the 2,200 kilocalories, the required amount to acquire the food equivalent to those calories is very different in the two settings. In the urban setting, you require 2,905 shillings per month, whereas in the rural setting, you'll require 2,331 shillings. Yeah, and then of course, other distinct characteristics include different economic opportunities, which are more in urban setting compared to rural setting. Yeah, so I'll begin first by looking at the trends across different counties in terms of food poverty incidence. And as you can see, there is huge disparity between more urban-based counties compared to more rural-based counties. That's one. But two is some of the semi-arid counties, for example, Samburu, Turkana, Mandera, are more prevalent. They have very high poverty rates, food poverty rates, compared to these other counties, for example, Nairobi, Nyeri, Kiambu, Nakuru, which are more urban-based. But you also find that some of the agricultural counties, for example, Bungoma, Uasin Gishu, are at the middle point, yeah, which means they still, I mean, the amount, I mean, they're still poor. They're not doing very well in terms of food poverty in comparison. Yeah. Yeah, this slide shows us the overall poverty. And as you can see, in comparison to the previous chart, yes, this one, the figure 3, in comparison to figure 1, you can see that the difference or the variance is more pronounced on overall poverty than food poverty. But almost similar counties appear at the extreme. You can see Nairobi, Kirinyaga, Kiambu appearing at the top, and you can as well see Garissa, Mandera, Turkana appearing at the bottom, and Wajir. So that distinction is very clear. So it means food poverty in that basket, in terms of contribution to overall poverty, food is the main contributor, because most households, in terms of the share of their expenditure in the basket, most of the spending is on food items. This one shows the hardcore poverty. So the difference between hardcore poverty and overall poverty is that hardcore poverty measures the poverty line from the amount required for food. So if you below that poverty line, it means that, for example, in rural it was 2,331. So if you are below this line, it means that you are not able to afford food. So this is the poverty line from 2,331 required for total consumption. Yeah. So if you are below this line, it means that you are not even able to afford food, not alone these other expenditures. So when you compare the disparity across different counties, this one is the one that has the most variance. Looking at the height of the bar, for example, Turkana, Samburu, Wajir, and Mandera, and compare it to Nairobi, there's a huge difference showing very high variance in terms of hardcore poverty. So it means that most households, in this case it's individuals, the amount that they require to spend on food is very, very low. Because, for example, Nairobi is 0, but Turkana and Samburu and Wajir, it is, for Turkana is above 40, which is above 45. Samburu is about 30 something. So there is that huge disparity. Next. Now, if we map out this hardcore poverty across the map of Kenya, you'll see that in terms of distribution, the counties with very high rates of hardcore poverty are Turkana, Samburu, Marsabit, Wajir, Mandera, the northern side. And these are the counties also that happen to have very high food and overall poverty. The areas that have very low are the central region and the lower side, Kajiado, Narok, and around Nyanza region, Siaya, Homa Bay, Kisumu. Yeah. You also find high rates in Kitui and Tana River. Yeah. So mainly arid and semi-arid have very high poverty rates. Next. Yeah, this one shows the geographical distribution of severity of poverty rate. So in terms of severity, here we are talking about extreme poverty. That is individuals who are very far below the poverty line, much below. So in this case, the formula formula for calculating severity of poverty rate, they square the poverty gap to arrive at severity of poverty rate. So it means that there are very much lower, in relative to the poverty line. So it means that in terms of policy interventions, it will require much more income or funds to lift these individuals from that very low bottom, from the to above the poverty line. Table 7, we want to illustrate the inequality, and the famous indicator for inequality is the Gini coefficient. So Gini coefficient, the way it is calculated is to arrange in order the population in terms of their income. So for each quantile, you look at the percentage of consumption, so in cumulative manner. So basically it is the Lorenz curve. The higher it is, the more inequality rate it is, and the lower, when it is 0, it means that we do not have any inequality, but 1, it means we have perfect inequality. So these numbers should be read together with the poverty rates numbers. You can see that the situation improved during COVID. From 2019 overall, national, it was 0.407, and 2020 it was 0.358, while in 2021 it wasn't. So it means that COVID tried to reduce the inequality. Those earning very high incomes were pulled down a bit. So it does not mean that inequality reduced in 2020, but still poverty rates actually increased in that period. And you expect that it will, as you can see, from 2020 to 2021, it is reverting back to pre-COVID period, which was 0.401. Now, this chart tries to compare between the levels of education and the poverty rate, and it shows, or let me say, inverse relationship between the level of education and the poverty rate. That means that as you move high in terms of level of education, the poverty rate becomes lower. As you can see, those who do not have any education, the first set of bars, they are in the range of around 65, whereas those who have who have attained the highest level of education at tertiary level, it is 2.6 for the case of urban and 3.2 for the case of national, showing that high correlation. So it means investment in education, they have positive results in terms of reducing poverty rate. Yeah, this one we try to look at child poverty across different years for the children, and we compare this with the total population. So child poverty, the way they arrive at it is looking at households that were poor. So if the household was poor, then it will be considered that the children in the household are also poor. So there is disparity, as you can see, between the ages 0 to 5. The poverty rate is different compared to ages 6 to 13 and 14 to 17, and even now overall 0 to 17. 0 to 5, national is 23.6%. So it means that out of the population, 7.5 million population that are between 0 to 5 years, a quarter, or almost a quarter of that population is food poor. This highlights the need for more targeted interventions, because if at the lower level, they're not able to access quality food, they're vulnerable to suffer some of the ailments, for example, malnutrition. Then 6 to 13, who are mostly primary going children, the rate is even higher. 32% for national. This still emphasizes the need for having these targeted intervention for households that are poor, because this may lead to dropouts from school. 14 to 17, who are mostly secondary, is even higher at 37.7. So in this figure, we try to look at overall poverty rates for children across the map of Kenya. And we can also see huge disparity between the central region and south region and Nyanza region compared to semi-arid, the northern region. So when you contrast between total population and children aged 0 to 5, there is that huge disparity. And it's more prevalent in areas like Turkana, and closer to central region, we have Isiolo, and then we also have Central Rift, Baringo, Elgeyo Marakwet, and Kericho Bomet. With the exception of Narok, this central region and lower Rift, South Rift has high rates of overall poverty. And we can see a similar pattern occurring for these ages 6 to 13, where we find Nairobi, Kiambu, Murang'a, Nyeri having better rates, lower rates, but this northern area having lower rates. And the northeastern area still has higher rates together with Turkana and Samburu. Yeah, similar to overall 0 to 17 years. So we asked ourselves how long it will take for Kenya to eradicate poverty. So to move from pre-COVID period, 2019 rates to zero. So we took them for the 4 years between 2015-16 to 2019, the average growth rate. In this case, for national, it dropped by 2.5 percentage points, rural 1.8, and urban 3.4 percentage points. So using those rates, assuming those rates to be constant, and also assuming the population to be stable, both rural and urban, we ask ourselves how long it will take to eradicate poverty in Kenya. So simulating this across the period, we saw that it will take 26 years to eradicate poverty in urban areas, while for rural, it will take 78 years. The reason why we have this disparity is because of the difference in terms of the growth rate. So you find urban, it is dropping much faster compared to rural area. It's dropping at a lower rate. So it will take more years for rural setup than it will take for urban setup. And this, we can say the rate of decrease is very low in terms of our Vision 2030 in terms of the SDG goals. So because for high quality of life, as it's envisioned in the Vision 2030, you'll find that at 2030, still will not have eradicated, still will be having very high rate. For urban, we'll be having around 18%, and for rural, it will be way above 30% poverty rates. Yeah, still we still have a long journey to eradicate, which means we need to step up in our policy intervention. We also asked ourselves amount that it will take us to pull out people that are below the poverty line, to move them out of that zone, and we compared overall. So food poor, the head count in terms of the percentage of population that is below, it is 30.5, as you can see in the first line. The number of these people is 15.1 million, 10.8 for rural and 4.3 for urban. Now, the amount of shillings, so we assumed that for everyone that is below, on average, we assume that they require the poverty, they require the amount equal to the poverty line. So 2.3 for rural and 2.9 for urban. And so in terms of amount on a monthly basis, it will be 25 billion for rural and 12 billion for urban. In total, it will be 37, almost 38 billion on monthly basis. On an annual basis, it is 452 billion. Yeah, as a share of GDP, it is 3.8 for national to lift people from poverty. Assuming this is just basic assumption. Assuming the current rate of shilling, the purchasing power of the shilling, and assuming the current rate of GDP. So it will be 3.8, and for overall, it is 9.3% of GDP, amount equivalent to 9.3% of GDP. Hardcore is 0.7% of GDP.
So thanks, Noah and Maureen. Now, this is what my two colleagues did. Discussing Kenya Poverty Report for 2021. And what we did was basically, my colleague Maureen ran us through a history of the poverty reports, provided a justification based on what the reasons, the very solid reasons that the National Bureau of Statistics lays for regular surveys, which obviously update and allow for measurement of the national reports. As we started these discussions, one of the first things that people think is that these are IEA's numbers. They're not. But because we want to create policy literacy, part of that is to actually go back to understand what kind of methods the National Bureau of Statistics used. So that's available in the report itself, but Maureen summarized that for us very well. And then we went to the poverty measurement. And there are many ways, but basically took three specific ones. Most basic, which is hardcore poverty. And we learned that for hardcore poverty, which is at 5.8%, what does it measure? Hardcore poverty measures the income that a family or a household earned for the whole month, and whether that income converted to food equivalent would be able to feed everybody at the required nutritional levels. And we found out that 5.8% of Kenyan, not households, 5.8% of the Kenyan population do not, on a monthly basis, have sufficient money to feed themselves. 5.8% comes down to about 5.8% of the population, bringing it down to about 1 minute. Let me just read it right here. Poor households. Okay, here, yes. So 5.8% is 2.8 million people. 2.8 million people, 2.87 million people are unable to feed themselves. Overall poverty again measured in terms of food purchases, in addition to other personal items that people require on a day-to-day basis, obviously including clothing, energy, and all that. And here it goes to 38.6% of the Kenyan population, 19 million people, based on the population numbers for 2021, under poverty, basically overall poverty rates. And then we go down to the food poverty, basically people who do not have sufficient money or resources, whether they buy or whether they receive from as gifts or whether they grow their own food. 30.5% of Kenya's population, which you can see on this chart, representing 15 million people, do not have sufficient money. And then obviously there's an urban and rural split, but basically the urban and rural split tells you two things. One is that urban people, while they spend more money on food, have lower poverty rates in general over the three measurements, 3 dimensions than rural. And then of course in rural numbers, it's higher. So basically when people also farm, it's also very high. She then let us understand that on a national level, Kenyans spend 56.3% of their income, 56.3% of income buying food, adequate food. And what that tells you is that basically Kenyans work for 7 months just to be able to afford food. On the rural areas, it's 63%, obviously 63% going down to close to 8 months. Urban areas, it's a little less, it's 42%. So basically 5, right? 5 of 12 months are used to buy food. And then in slide 14, which we've just seen, there's a summary statistics by each of those those areas, which, as I said, 5.8% of Kenyan individuals live under conditions of hardcore poverty, which means they do not have sufficient resources to buy enough food to keep them alive according to the recommendations that are required. So the people who are undernourished. The overall poverty rate is 38.6, and obviously food poverty rate is 30.5, representing those numbers. Then she presented the paradox. The paradox told us that basically during COVID, two things happened. While the poverty rates rose, the inequality actually reduced, meaning that inequality could move in different directions from poverty. But even that, I mean, that allows us to actually understand that connection, that very complicated connection between poverty and inequality. But one thing that is clearer from the data that she was also showed to us is that employment numbers in Kenya have not gone back to the pre-poverty, the pre-COVID areas, obviously, and that's part of the reason that has driven, as you can see from this, as we can see, I mean, we can see from this, the income GDP per capita at constant rates, obviously in 2021, came back to 190, so obviously it's peaked. Gross domestic product growing fast as well, but informal sector employment, which peaked at 2019 at 15 million. Oh, really? Just basically recovered in the year 2021. So obviously employment numbers between, in 2019, total employment numbers in 2019 were actually still higher than they were in 2021, as you can see from the formal employment numbers quite here. Then NOAA came in, and one of the things that it tells us is, in addition to what Maureen has mentioned, was there's a big correlation between education levels of household members, right? The highest education attained by the household head, and poverty rates generally. So you can see here from figure 1, suggesting, or rather it's showing us a very, very strong correlation, almost causative, that the higher the education attainment of the household head, the lower the levels of poverty that obtain within a household. I think that answers itself. And that's part of the reason why, yes, it's very, very clear to us that there are structural causes to poverty. One of them, obviously, is the more education that is available and its provision. Definitely, it's one of the solutions to poverty through employment, but obviously, because that determines income. And then we spoke about child poverty numbers, that it tells us that 1/4 of children below the age of 5, 23.6% of children below, or rather 26% of children below the age of 5 live in poor households. And those are households that cannot afford food, telling us that a good number of children are actually undernourished. If you talk about the number of children in the Kenyan population, that's indeed a very serious matter. But as you go up higher, 32% of children between the ages of 6 to 13, in other words, children who are in primary school, are undernourished, 32%. So maybe it's not a bad thing when the Deputy President mentions that school feeding problem is problem. Framing this question about school feeding and all that might be actually useful, because it's telling us that 1 in 3 children walking into schools is undernourished, or rather lives in a household that is poor and therefore probably undernourished. And it gets worse for 14 to 17, high school kids, 37% of them as well. So you can see that there's a movement, basically starting from 26%, 1/4 of children 5 and below live in households that are poor. It gets to 32% for children in primary school, and obviously for children in young people, teens between 14 to 17 who are in high school, it's even worse. So obviously there's an intersection between poverty and schooling, and maybe designing school systems could be one of the solutions that we need to explore over poverty. And then we went to figure 10, which is basically a thought experiment. So yes, we did not just want to throw numbers at you and to dump numbers at you. Really, that tells nothing. The media already did a lot with this report. So Noah and Maureen go back to asking themselves, so we have the poverty numbers, what does it tell us? And I think this is an important take home for us, which tells you that at the present rates of the reduction of poverty, it would take 78 years to eliminate poverty in Kenya at the rates at which, rural poverty in Kenya, at the rates at which the diminution is taking place. Now we can decide for ourselves whether that's a good or not good number on us, but I'm not sure that Kenya's children, and I'm sure not sure most of us, are prepared to wait 78 years to diminish poverty. So that will be beyond 21, beyond 2100. Needless to say, I mean, some of us would not be alive. So obviously stepping up ambitions to ensure that Kenya is a society free of absolute poverty is something that is imagined. If you take the urban area numbers, it's 26, because urban area numbers are growing at 3 times the rate of rural areas. And remember, urban areas require more resources and more income. So obviously, this simulation is based on the assumptions that the numbers remain as they are. But on the whole, what it tells us in that gap is basically that urban areas are actually solving the problem of poverty better. Why? I think it's clear that it's an income question. And so when you bring the two numbers together, it brings us to the 50 years. So basically, we have another half century. In other words, Kenya will have been independent for 150 years. No, 110 years, right? Another 50 years. At the 110th anniversary celebration, only then we'll be talking about diminishing poverty to 0. So I think that's a good thought experiment because it helps us. Now, this is one of the things that comes from putting those numbers together and then asking ourselves, so what? So here we're talking about the third part, creating literacy, but also trying to simulate positions for why responding to poverty in Kenya is actually a very urgent question. Then we go to table 9 and ask ourselves, okay, fine. What would be required? What would be required to, as students of economics, we ask ourselves then, what would be required to actually reduce poverty rates? Partly because as we've defined poverty here, a very sensitive and actually globally adopted measure. It's first about meeting food and nutrition needs for members of a household, and then obviously other goods that are required. So we ask ourselves, how much money would be required, or how much resources would be required to be invested or placed on the table to actually solve these problems? Because it's one thing to simply identify them, but without that. So we have it here, and the numbers show us that basically hardcore poverty would require just 0.7% of gross domestic product today. And remember, hardcore poverty are the households that do not have enough money to keep themselves alive. I mean, according to the nutrition level. So it would be 0.7% of GDP. Something like, I think it's about annually 82 billion for the whole country, of which obviously of that 82 billion, 72 billion would be dedicated to rural areas because, hardcore poverty problems are actually more pronounced in rural areas, and then 8% for urban areas. So for 82 billion shillings in a year, Kenya would solve the question of hardcore poverty. Now it becomes more serious at the overall poverty level. I mean, for food poverty, let's go to food poverty. It's 452 billion, equivalent to 3.8% of GDP. Again, 2.5% of GDP would be going to rural areas, and 1.2% of GDP would be going to urban areas. We come to the overall poverty problem, and here, of course, it's a much bigger one. It would require 9.3% of GDP. Remember, that's close to about 2/3. Close to just close to about 45-46% of all government revenue collections. If all that money was simply diverted back in terms of a distribution of resources, it would take 9.3% of gross domestic product to solve the overall poverty problem. And then the rural poverty part split between rural and urban poverty to 5.4 and 3.8. So I think this is a really, really important figure. And it's, in our view, the value add that the IEA puts to this discussion today. So that's basically it. Of course, we had those figures that show us the regional distribution, and we know where if you can talk geospatial mapping, poverty does not just have a household character, it has a geospatial character, which means the more arid areas of Kenya, which have the fewer public goods and public investments, show higher levels of poverty, both in terms of rates, but also the number of people who live in poverty. And then it comes back across the area. Rural areas do worse than urban areas. Employment opportunities, the quality of that employment, obviously the educational factors as well. So I think there are things that can be done for poverty immediately, and there are things that basically are structural that require us to solve. So obviously education and health provision are significant, and my colleagues have argued that. So ladies and gentlemen, I wish not to conclude this, but I thought this was such a significant thing, and our intention was actually to summarize that and to put in some insights and extract some lessons. So I'd like to open it for conversation now, and you could do two things. If you have any questions, you could place it in the chat box, and I've checked the chat box. There seem to be no questions so far. We provided a link to the report, which is important for all of you, but I'll now open up a conversation so that you can raise your hands, ask a question to either Maureen or Noah, And then we'll try and answer that question and close in time as we had promised. So we have a question here from Henry Benjamin, who says, well, he thanks Maureen and Noah for the fantastic presentation. He has two questions. One, is it really possible to eradicate poverty, considering that poverty is not a static phenomenon, i.e., as other get out of poverty lines, others sleep under? Okay, so basically the transient and dynamic nature of poverty. So that's more or less like a philosophical question. We can talk about that for more, and Maureen and Noah, you can answer that. On the second one, on the projected funds meticulously presented as a percentage of GDP required to lift the poor out of poverty line, what is the best approach to utilize the billions, assuming it becomes available? Give it directly to the poor or investment in the economy? And what about the sustainability question? Okay, so those two questions, I hope you've taken them in, Maureen and Emmanuel. I mean, Maureen and Noah. Then there's Ken. Looking at the financial resources required to address poverty, do we need to have conversations regarding division of revenue between national and county and national governments? Okay, so let's accept those questions for the time being. Okay, Maureen, please come forth. I'll come back to Joanne to see whether we can her question could be presented. So let's go to Maureen. Any of the two questions, please. Go ahead.
He's asking, is it really possible to eradicate poverty, considering that poverty is not a static phenomenon, such as other get out of poverty lines, others sleep under? I'd like to take us back to the simulation. It was just like drawing a scenario where if government allocated, we were working with the 2021 poverty rate numbers. If government allocated certain amounts, say to the national poverty across the three poverty lines, it will take certain amounts to eradicate poverty if we go by that year. And I'd also like to think, given health and education expenditure by government, if government probably prioritizes on spending in health and education, it might reduce, because it's more or less interchangeable, because the people who are poor today might not be poor in 10 years to come. Suppose they get like better education and better healthcare, which translates to more income and prosperity in future, which will more or less eradicate poverty.
Thanks, Maureen. I would also like to agree with Maureen that it's possible to eradicate poverty. And when you look at the SDG goal 1 is no poverty, and I think it is there for a reason. And the reason why I think it's possible also is because the poverty line is also not static. The poverty line will shift according to amount of calories required and the amount of money required to purchase the equivalent, adult equivalent of those calories, the 2,200 calories. So while currently we have seen it is 2,331 for rural and 2,900 for urban, and we have also seen that generally the income levels according to GDP per capita have been increasing. So with those trends, it's possible to increase in terms of the income if we open up more economic activities, more job opportunities, and tackle the issue of inflation. We are able to have more real incomes to the households, who will then be able to move out of poverty. Yeah, so I think I have strongest view that is possible to eradicate. Now, you have also asked the second question. You ask the best way to invest this amount of shillings, and I think the best way is to target we should have more target these social programs, these socioeconomic programs, like the school feeding programs and pesa kwa wazee, all these should be more targeted. And apart from just being targeted, we should also approach it from the hardcore poverty. Hardcore poverty it means that they do not have even enough to buy food. They don't have enough money even to buy food. So these are very extreme cases, and by targeting these individuals will have more high impact, because and second is the children, because by targeting the households who have poor children, we are able to also address the issue of school dropouts, or in a way reduce the school dropouts due to lack of food and what have you. So yes, I think that is the best, in my view, that is the best way to address it. Yeah. And then I think this is Ken. You asked, looking at the financial resources required to address poverty, do we need to have conversation regarding division of revenue between national and county government? Yes, no doubt, we need to have that conversation. And looking at the equalization fund and even the equitable share of fund, we need to address the inequalities. I mean, using this data should help us to inform the revenue or the fourth generation formula for the distribution of resources to the counties. Yeah.
Why is Migori lagging behind in the poverty numbers as compared to other Nyanza counties? What may be the specific gap? And then says thank you. So Noah and Mo, you might want to open up that poverty and then discuss what your views are. But it might require us to actually get more data. But let's see who has what ideas you have. And then we have Bill. Bill asks the question: do we have an interpretation on the impact of corruption on the poverty rate? And thanks. Wow. Okay. So that again is a political economy question. Any other questions before I come back to Noah and Mo? Okay. Noah and Movin, you have two questions. One is about what do you think is a diagnostic about Migori County's numbers, and two is basically an interpretation of the impact of corruption on the poverty rate generally and nationally. I think you can procure some. I mean, you can provide some thoughts on that. So this time I'll start with Noah, and then I'll come to Mo. Noah, please switch on your mic and your camera so we can see you, and then you can answer any one of those questions.
Let me begin with the question by Bill. Do we have an interpretation of the impact of corruption on poverty rate? Yes, I think there is impact of corruption and on poverty generally, and I think it widens the gap, and I think especially it widens those who are at the extremes, very far below the poverty line, the severity of poverty. And this is because corruption affects fair distribution of resources across the population. So you'll have income be concentrated in fewer hands, and in that case, you'll find those who deserve to receive these resources will be affected in terms of being able to access those economic opportunities. For example, going to school and not being able to receive adequate or quality healthcare. And if you're not able to access quality education, quality health, that has a huge impact, as we've already seen in the chart, that a very strong inverse relationship. Those with higher education tend to have lower poverty. So, yeah, so I think there's that high correlation between corruption and poverty, but also to some extent the inequality. Yeah. For Migori, yeah, so Migori, yes, you're right. You're in terms of your observation. So, but I don't know exactly what is causing Migori to rank very low. Yeah, maybe that is something that I need to investigate further. But it's true that it has very high poverty rates, and also some of the we neighboring, we have for like Homa Bay, which did very well in terms of overall poverty. Yeah, but Migori is very low. Yeah, maybe that is something that I need to find out more. Yeah. Maureen, I don't know if you may have something.
Okay, for the Nyanza counties, okay, I'm not so sure, but you might find a county is doing well in terms of food poverty, then in terms of overall poverty, that's the food and non-food expenditure, it's worse off. So I'm not really sure what's causing the specific gap in terms of, yeah, because I really like to understand your question in whether it's in terms of food poverty, overall poverty, or hardcore poverty. And do you have an interpretation on the impact of corruption and the poverty rate? I like to think corruption in terms, just to agree with what my colleague Noah has said before, corruption might affect the equal distribution of resources, and maybe the funds that will be used in, say, healthcare or education expenditure might affect someone who's at the extreme end. And this might increase the intergenerational poverty, whereby if maybe the head of a household did not get maybe they got maybe little education levels, this would interpret their income levels, and if they still get maybe low allocation of resources in terms of education, it will translate to maybe their kid and their future generations. And there's also the concern with the figure of 7.5% growth rate at 2021, considering this was immediately after COVID-19. This was explained by the several fiscal and monetary policy measures that the government used to intervene into this situation to encourage the rebound. And this was through waivers, reduction in interest rates for loans and other things. And this facilitated the growth from 0.3% to 7.5% in terms of GDP growth in 2021. Yeah, thank you.
We have a couple of other questions. There's a question by Toto Chakara. She asks, thank you for the presentation. Kenya has had several interventionist policies and strategies on and for poverty reduction over years. Given the statistics, what can we say has been the effect of those? So you can talk about the effects of PRSPs. And then there's Maureen Wendra. Were you able to compare whether there was any county that has improved its poverty rate from 2019 to 2021? So that too we can think about, Maureen. We'll see that. And John comes back again. She says, thank you. I would like to understand what informs the variation in overall poverty rates as compared to other sibling lower counties that are relatively better. Okay, so you get in touch directly. Well, that might require diagnostic and looking at those figures a little bit more. But yes, I'm sure there's a correlation between that and some other socioeconomic data. So basically, let me answer for Peter. Peter, you asked a question about you're concerned with the figure of 7.5 7.5% growth rate at 2021, considering this was immediately after COVID. Precisely. And immediately after COVID, basically, remember the economy had gone down to 0.3%. So that was a bounce back effect. So the fact that obviously people were coming back from work out of resuming work after the stay-at-home policies and all that, and the effect of the immunization, because the vaccine became available, it was much clear that it was safe. It provided a level of confidence for people to come back to work, and I think that's what explained that. Yes, so basically it was coming off a low base effect. The 7.5% was not subsequently retained in 2022, as we saw, and obviously part of that was just basically the fact, a bounce back effect from a low base. So we have two more questions here from Toto and from Maureen. And obviously, Maureen and Maureen Barasa and Noah, please. Oh, there's one more question. Well, Martin says that, thank you, Maureen and Noah, for the PowerPoint. I'm just curious whether you thought of a best mix of policy interventions which would be best effective in eradicating poverty. Having seen the almost positive correlation between education and poverty rates, how does poverty correlate with other factors? Okay. Fine, that's a question from Martin as well. And then the fourth, final one is Richard. The relationship between increased employment rate and education as driving factor in poverty reduction. I'm not too sure what that means, but well. So Maureen, you can start on any of those two questions, and then we'll come to Noah, and then I'll have an opportunity for final questions before we close.
Okay, I'd like to answer Maureen's question on whether we were able to compare whether there was any county that had improved its poverty rates from 2019 to 2021. Okay, we were not able to do this, but we'll be able to do better analysis on poverty rate from 2019 to 2021, and probably put it out there for a better understanding in the changes in the rates. And yeah, I think, thank you.
I'd like to respond to the question by Itoto Echakara. So Itoto, she asks, Kenya has had several interventionist policies and strategies on and for poverty reduction over the years. Given the statistics, what can we say has been the effect of those policies? Yeah, so one clear example of this impact of policies that we can see is the effect of COVID, the impact of those policies, especially the economic stimulus packages on poverty rates during COVID. And perhaps, Maureen, you can go to table 5. So this table shows that during COVID, there was increase in the poverty rate. In 2019, the overall poverty rate was 33.6%, but during COVID, it increased. The rate increased to 42.9. But that's now when this economic stimulus package, also together with the relief funds from the likes of IMF, and we also had some targeted policies, and also we also saw cooperation from the commercial banks in terms of reducing the rates of withdrawing cash and all that. So we have seen that the rate improved from, as you can see, it improved from 42.9 overall percent to 38.6%. Yeah. So I think this we can attribute it to some of those policies. We can also see food poverty in terms of overall also reduced from 34.4% to 30.5%, a reduction of 3.9 percentage points. And urban even reduced at a greater margin, 33 for food poverty, 33% to 26.8%, a reduction of 6.2 percentage points. Yeah, so I think there is that, I mean, those, impact of policies that we can see. And we think that if we have more targeted policies, we can see even much more improvement in these rates. But just to mention is that this rate, the 2021 rate, which is 38.6 for overall, it is still higher compared to pre-COVID period, which is 33.6. So it means that we are not still yet back pre-COVID period. Then the question by Martin, you asked, I'm just curious whether you thought of a best mix of policy interventions which will be best effective in eradicating poverty. Having seen the most positive correlation between education and poverty rates, how does poverty correlate among others? Among other factors, yes. Yes, thanks for the question. So I think the approach is not we do not have just we should not have just a single approach to eradicating poverty, but rather a more multifaceted approaches will be best in eradicating this poverty. Because as Kwame has mentioned, we have that poverty that hits most for areas, hits most in terms of food poor, but also overall poor. Then we also have hardcore, and also you have geographical distribution. Yeah, so that these multi-dimensional approaches will be best. So we have various tools for interventions. We have, for example, devolution, and we have equitable. The formula, the CRF formula for distribution of resources. And then we also have these national programs. So I think we need to have all these, improve all these interventions and improve in terms of targeting. And also, in the past, we also had a gap in terms of availability of data. And as Maureen has mentioned, they have tried to reduce the gap in terms of when these statistics are released. So in the previous period, we used to have a 10-year gap. So we had a 2015-16, and we had the census 2019. Yeah, but that has now been reduced. And according to KNBS, they intend to release this on annual basis. So I think these policies can be improved based on this more up-to-date data. Yeah. So other factors, apart from health, apart from education, we also have health as some of the factors that drive decline or drive the reduction in the poverty rates. Yeah.
So Maureen asks whether there are between education and poverty, how does poverty correlate with other factors there? So if you saw that map of the overall poverty rates in the country, and you can see that the Northeast and the Northwest have some of the highest incidences of poverty. If you look at it as well, basically the first, yes, so here. So if you look at that West Pokot Turkana area, and you look at the Wajir, Mandera areas, some of the shared attributes of these areas is that they're very insecure. So the absence of public goods of security, which obviously can create poverty in the form of what we hear in the forms of threat to lives, people's property, and all that. So yes, it's obviously not one thing. I mean, we've seen the strongest correlation as education attainment and household leadership. It's not just one thing, but obviously you can tell the unavailability of security for personal security and the security of property. Obviously, other things that could be available, such as water. Just 2 days ago, the national press was awash with stories about a dam that was supposed to be constructed somewhere in Marsabit. Government spent paid 2 billion shillings. There's no dam, and the place was not even cleared. So obviously that connects the absence of that kind of infrastructure. That's not infrastructure that people can create privately. It ties back to the question of the effect of corruption on poverty rates. I think corruption also has an effect. Among them would be the diversion of resources, such as the dam money, which was paid for by the public sector, but obviously the dam was not made available. Its effects in terms of making water available, whether for private use, whether for irrigation or any other thing, is something that we can just guess. The other reason why corruption is a problem, and this is national government level corruption, is obviously it makes wrong policy choices. So as we can see here, the wrong policy choices being made might divert resources away from expenditure on whether it's schools or the things that are actually known to reduce the levels of poverty and improve human welfare, to more spectacular things such as stadiums. We have not seen a correlation between the number of stadiums available in a place and poverty rates, for instance. But obviously that's one other thing. So it's very, very clear that it's not a single thing that determines poverty rates and determines it everywhere. But I think the things that we see through these greener parts of this picture suggest to us certain things. It's clear human safety is one of them. Opportunities for employment is one of them. Productivity and agricultural services definitely is one of them. Obviously, security, urbanization is another because it provides good employment, education, and health services. All these come together, pointing to us that there's still a big role for government to play. And one other interventionist thing that we say, that I don't know what we mean by interventionist, because government is generally interventionist. I don't know what every policy is interventionist in my view. But if you mean by government providing direct services, yes, they are. So we know that, for instance, cash transfers are actually a good relief for families. One person asked about the sustainability. If people are suffering, if 5.8% of the population have problems with hardcore poverty and they cannot buy food, spending 6 billion shillings, right, per month to make sure that they have enough food for people to be able to work, to make them less susceptible to diseases, in my view, is a fairly sustainable thing, because you're saving how many lives? That was 2.8 million lives, 3 million people's lives on account of spending 6 billion Kenya shillings. In my view, that's a sustainable program because it's something government could actually pay very, very easily. And over time, obviously, ensure that you support the lives of those children who then will be able to go to school and actually make the best of those opportunities that are available. So basically, that's it. So it's a whole spectrum of things. There are specific risks that rely on the spatial distribution. So if you live in some places, obviously you suffer some, you are more susceptible or vulnerable to some risks, whether it's a weather shock or others, than you are in other parts of the country. But that has to be accepted, and that's part of the reason why we have government. I think Noah already answered the question about, yes, what this tells us about the distribution of resources and devolution. Certainly so. And I think some of the choices that governments at the national and county level take in terms of focusing on population level, on real people poverty, is one that's essential here too. So I'll come back to final comments because I don't see any other comments from, any other questions. So I'll come to final comments from Mo and Maureen and Noah. So please make your final comments and then you can close the meeting.
Yes.
Maureen, is she there? Okay, Noah, go ahead, Noah.
Yeah, thanks, Kwame. Yeah, mine is to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining. Yeah, in a nutshell, we have seen, thanks to Kenya National Bureau of Statistics for releasing this kind of report and also improving, shortening the time when they release numbers on poverty. And we think that this is an opportunity for us, both in terms of the civil society organizations, but also on the government side, to collaborate in terms of providing more insights that will improve in terms of our policy interventions. Yeah, we have seen the impact of COVID, and to some extent we have seen the positive impact of the policy interventions. And so that can help in terms of, better policy choices can help in terms of reducing that gap. Yeah, but then on overall, we see there's a long way to go in terms of eradicating poverty in Kenya. And there is a lot of resources that is required to achieve this, which means there is need to have a more focus in terms of efficiency in the utilization of the available resources and improved targeting of these interventions. Yeah, maybe we need to step up in terms of, doing other types of analysis to have more insights. For example, we need to do in terms of tax incidences to identify the level of impact in terms of who is sharing, who is shouldering the heaviest burden when it comes to tax policy changes. Yeah, so that is something that we also need to carry along as we debate on these overall policy issues like the finance bill. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Maureen, are you there to give us your final comments? Yes.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending this webinar. And it's quite interesting looking at the Kenya Poverty Report, looking at the numbers in terms of counties and also the national level. And we can see like the huge disparities and the poverty lines in different counties keep on changing, and probably it needs a multifaceted approach in interventions to eradicate poverty. And yeah, I'd like to encourage everyone to keep on looking at the Kenya Poverty Report and gaining insights from it. Yeah, thank you.
Indeed, with the exception of the shock of COVID, the level of poverty, the number of Kenyans, the ratio of Kenyans living under poverty is going down, but it's reducing at a pace that is, in my view, less than what a fair expectation should be. And obviously, with population growing, it needs to go at a faster rate than the population. Otherwise, it means that more people, in absolute terms, will be living under poverty than is ideal. So obviously, that's the first thing. The second thing, it's telling us that yes, I think as my colleagues have said, it has both a spatial character, which is urban-rural. It has a household structure character, which is basically the more educated the household had, the lower the levels of poverty. And we think that that is not necessarily a spurious connection. It's actually a strong connection, suggesting that obviously what we accept as public services in Kenya, the quality of education and the access that education provides to employment, and by extension, income, is an essential part for this. So there's a private sector performance kind that you see in urban areas where basically markets work more efficiently, or at least there's more specialization and more markets and more employment opportunities that is also useful. Don't forget the fact that the other underlying factors, some that are not in the direct control of households or individuals. And this is where government policy becomes here. But I think for me, the profound question is, for hardcore poverty, which is just basically keeping people alive, the cost of quote unquote eliminating hardcore poverty in Kenya based on these numbers is so minimal that it should be our priority in all public engagements. For 6 billion shillings a month, reducing hardcore poverty in Kenya, where people are able to buy food for the 2.9 million people, is an effort that should actually not even have to be justified. It should be effortless. These numbers shouldn't tell us that, look, we actually need to find these people. It's very possible to do that very quickly, very efficiently, and often cash transfers, which government is already doing, needs to be expanded. We know there are questions about their transparency, but finding the people who actually require and solving hardcore poverty at the basic level, to fail to do that, in my view, is just basically to fail to do that, given its cost and the size of government in general, is just basically neglecting very vulnerable people. So I think these are, it's It's a special interest group, in my view. Hardcore poor people are a special interest group. They're spread throughout the country, and it's such a small number that doing justice to them would be essential. In addition to that, we have to learn that Kenya is mostly a country of young people. 37% of people between the ages of 14 to 17 are living in poverty conditions. 32% of those between the ages of 6 to 7. In other words, 1 in 3 primary school children lives in a household that is poor. And 25% of children between the ages of 0 to 5, basically the ECD, are living in households of poverty. Tells you that our entire education system, which is the biggest and in my view the most successful public sector program in Kenya, itself has another problem of hunger and poverty. I think using that institutional structure that government has to try to intervene in this issue is one big opportunity, and that opportunity should be exploited. So the Kenya Poverty Report tells us one thing, and I think it also tells us that inequality and poverty are not necessarily the same thing. I think inequality is a measurement related to income differences. Poverty is one that is felt in very real terms, as the 3 measures of poverty have shown us. So in our view, we hope that our intention, which is basically to open up a conversation, to create knowledge about this, and to have this kind of questions that have been asked by Joanne and others, become essential for us, and that anybody who attended this meeting is more educated about Kenya's poverty numbers than they were before they attended this, and we'll continue these conversations. I'd like us all to give to acknowledge my colleagues Noah and Maureen, and thanks for my other colleagues from the Institute of Economic Affairs who put together this meeting. I'd like also to know that IEA is an institution of professional members. We open up our opportunity for anybody to become a member. If you're interested in conversations such as this and to contribute in any other way, we'd be glad for you to join us. And finally, thank you very much.